Ladies and gentlemen, get the book Dr. Joshua Bowen wrote, The Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament. It is extremely full of knowledge and information for anyone, as well as join the Patreon. There's hundreds of videos that have been not released to the internet. You can ask questions and I will record them with these scholars in high definition. I do that all the time. You can also personal message me and you help the community grow. Thanks a lot. Dr. Joshua Bowen, I've got a Patreon member named Michael Baca. He says, here is one more for Dr. Bowen. How should Old Testament scholars resolve differences between so-called minimalists like Thomas L. Thompson and Russell Gmirkin and others like Ronald Hendel, who have radically different positions on dating Old Testament text? Is there a way of resolving this? Does it really matter? Just curious how he would respond. Of course, the evidence should decide this, but how can equally qualified scholars come up with radically different ways of dating the text? I suppose the same could be held with the New Testament with scholars like Dr. Price, who date the Gospels much later than most other scholars. Keep up the terrific work, Derek. I don't know how you have time to do all these interviews. My gosh, have hardly the time to watch them.
That makes a good point. So yeah, I absolutely think that the evidence needs to drive that. I don't think that all of these scholars are equally qualified. So I think we should be careful about that. It's one of the reasons that I think it's very important when you read a book by somebody, or you read an article by someone, or you see someone give an interview in a YouTube channel. Your first reaction, I think, should be Google them, and don't just, oh, it says PhD. Well, let's move on. Like, look at what their PhD is in. Right, look at where they got it. And I know that sounds a little, I don't know, what does that sound like? A little?
No, I mean, it's good because, like,
elitist. That's not what I mean.
Thomas L. Thompson, for example, what is his PhD in?
I want to say that he's a historian. I have a friend.
American theologian. Is an American-born Danish biblical scholar and theologian. He was professor of theology in the University of Copenhagen from 1993 to 2009. He currently lives in Denmark. So, theologian.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to be careful about who's, where we're getting our information. And look, don't think that just because you found someone that went to a really good school, that means that they obviously know what they're talking about. I think it's a good thing to sort of, I don't want to say statistically, maybe that's a good way to do it, but generally it's sort of a rule of thumb. If you've got somebody that's going to a Harvard or a Yale or Berkeley or, University of Texas, Austin or something like that, like those programs are just of necessity more rigorous, right? And so I would say, probably statistically speaking, you have people that are better trained when they come out. Now, again, all of it has to come down to what the data say, and what interpretive model best accounts for it. This, though, is why we focus so much with our channel and the books that I write on consensus scholarship. Because in a lot of cases, if you know a really good journalist doesn't have necessarily an expertise in the topics that they talk about. They can't. Right, because they just have to be versatile. They have to have a good base of knowledge in a lot of different topics, sort of this jack of all trades, master of none sort of thing. And in doing so, then they can read into what most people are saying about this. So let me bring this back to the question. A lot of the topics that we're talking about, like minimalist versus maximalist, I think he asks a good question. Does it matter? It depends. in my dissertation, does it matter if the unorthographic MSL texts from Kish are being used by those that are participating in the ritual so they can read along with the music? Well, I guess it depends. If you're asking about a debate, between me and another Assyriologist who works on liturgical texts about how these unorthographic texts function, yeah, it matters. But that's pretty narrow, right?
Right. So putting it in biblical sense to kind of it matters in the sense of trying to understand what we have, what we're working with. For example, if I Googled Thomas L. Thompson, right here in the second paragraph in Wiki, it says, Thompson is part of the minimalist movement known as the Copenhagen School, a group of scholars who hold that the Bible cannot be used as a source to determine the history of ancient Israel, and that Israel itself is a problematic concept. Now, some, not maximalist, if you could use the term, because Handel's not a maximalist either.
Right.
He would be kind of in the middle, a balanced take on these things. But it matters, I guess, because there probably are some things that you can glean in Handel's view to say this might have some historical verisimilitude to Israel's history. Whereas minimalist might go, like even the whole united monarchy, off the table. Don't pretend like this. Now, 12 tribes, that might be mythical. Even some people like Handel might go, well, there weren't 12 tribes. But there were tribes and there were regions of people, whatever. So I guess it matters, like you said, within the debate of the...
Yeah. And this is the thing that if we're thinking about this from the perspective of like online debates, and if we're like with what I do, let's say, I'm engaging with people that have more fundamentalist approaches to the biblical text. These finer points, for example, really good example, actually, I think, the Exodus. Whether cultural memory is the way that we want to understand the Exodus, or if we want to think about this as, following a slightly more maximalist view, not to get into all the different, but there are different ways that people understand the Exodus event, or events. Do we want that's a good one. Do we want to see it as one event, and that event is oppression in Canaan? Do we want to see it as two events or two types of events, like there were slaves in Egypt and there was oppression? Do we want to see it as just slaves in Egypt? Like, those are interesting discussions. I think they're very important. But in my chapter that I'm writing for volume 2 of the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, when I write about the Exodus, I'm barely going to get into any of it because that's not relevant. The question that we're asking is, the picture that's painted by the biblical text, is that historically reliable? Mm-hmm. And the answer is no, right? So did 2.5 million people walk out of Egypt? No. So how people get at the historical kernel of truth behind that, or what actually lies behind it, I think is very interesting, and it's a great discussion, very important discussion. Oftentimes online, that's not really the necessary thing to focus in on. In the same way that in the discussion about did Moses write the Pentateuch, you don't really have to get into, well, is documentary hypothesis right, or is supplementary hypothesis right, or it's just, look, don't even worry about it. Let's focus in on, did one person write it? No. And if you can establish that, that's all you need. That's all you really need to do. So I think that's probably the case. It's probably not the most satisfying answer, but I would say that it's important to look at what is it that consensus scholars agree on. They're all going to differ on some things, but what is it that everybody holds to? And in the same way, final thing, in the same way that if you ask Joel Baden, he'll tell you that somebody like Reinhard Kratz would say that even though he holds to more of a supplementary view, or even a little bit of the fragmentary hypothesis, and he doesn't hold to the documentary hypothesis, that he has a whole article basically saying, look, here's what we all agree on, right? It went through this editorial process. There's some aspects of source criticism. I mean, the documentary hypotheses that are right, and some are supplementary, and they probably all fit together in some way. But here's what we all agree on. And I think those are the things that initially, at least, we all need to be looking at. So we start on the what is it that all these scholars that are in the field agree on? What do they say is correct? And that's why I think like a book by Lester Gravy, the one about what do we know, essentially, or William Deaver, his book about what do we know about ancient Israel. I think these are good books to sort of get at what is it the mainstream scholars say about this.
And just for the record, I think I asked Russell Gamirkin if he's a minimalist, and he said no. I think he said he's not a minimalist. He takes a radical position in terms of when he thinks the compilation, like the redactors, actually completed the text. So like understanding when the Hebrew Bible was written as a total thing. He then says he thinks maybe a decade or two prior to the Septuagint. Whereas he says that doesn't mean the sources don't go further back, that the sources aren't older, and that there's a lot of oral potentially and written material that goes way back. He is not closed off to that, it sounds like. So he just thinks that the Hebrew Bible itself as...
its canonical form.
Right. He thinks that that's when it was written. And so others would say 5th century, probably, something like that. And so he's got a radical position there, but he said he isn't a minimalist, like I think Thomas L. Thompson, which puts him in a strange position. So I need to ask him. But yeah, this is great.
And I mean, to be clear, just last thing that I'll say, like the history of ancient Israel is certainly not my specialization. It's a very complicated topic. And, I can recommend obviously a lot of good books to talk about it, but that's why, in the same way, being able to drill down into the different aspects of the documentary hypothesis, the supplementary hypothesis, and be able to argue around all the nuances, it's a lifetime of work. But I don't know that it's the right way to go, depending on your goals. If your goals are online to sort of engage with these bad ideas, you probably don't need to go that direction. Your attention could focus on broader areas of agreement between most biblical scholars.
Thank you.
Sure.